You don't know what the fantasy genre is. I know. You are sure you know what the fantasy genre is. I mean, how could you not? It's really not that complicated, or is it? This essay is kind of long, but it will construct the definition of fantasy from first principles, and go over how we can improve the genre in the future. So, what is fantasy? In the beginning, there was Aristotle. Always fucking Aristotle, man. But Aristotle laid out 3 genres: deliberative rhetoric, judicial rhetoric, and epidictic rhetoric. Deliberative rhetoric juxtaposes potential future outcomes to communicate support or opposition for a given action or policy. Judicial rhetoric, quote, encompasses any discussion of past action, including legal discourse. And finally, epidictic rhetoric, which is also often called praise and blame rhetoric, covers any rhetoric that, as you might expect, does praise and blame during ceremonies. These were the only 3 genres Aristotle identified. I don't feel like I need to point this out, but this is a severely limiting system. In fact, here's a quote from genre studies expert Carolyn Miller about the Aristotelian genres.
David Coffer makes a telling point about classical Greek rhetoric when he observes that the number of definable types of rhetorical situations in classical culture appears both curiously small and stable. The 3 Aristotelian genres signal a particular and limited role for rhetoric, according to Coffer, but a very important one, maintaining the normal functions of the state.
So, over time, as the amount of literature increased, we had to find a way to classify it more specifically. This led to our current conception of genre. Now, for the most part, I'm going to pretend like you have a good idea of what our modern conceptions of genre are. In a vague sense, it really comes intuitively to us. The important note is that contemporary conceptions of genre divide works taxonomically by form and substance. For example, here is an excerpt from Brian Attebery about how fantastical genres split off from realism in the way we know them today.
Whereas once upon a time, I use the phrase advisedly, storytelling was divided into things that were true, history, and things that weren't, romance. Now the division comes at quite another point. Once the realistic novel was invented, it claimed kinship to history and denied its ties to romance. Hence, the gulf opened between histories true or feigned, on the one hand, and fantasies on the other. Accordingly, the more history-like a novel seemed, the more highly it was regarded, and the less incentive writers had to exploit the romance-like potential of the form.
So, Attebery hints at something here. Okay, well, it's not really hints as much as he lays it out clearly in the book, but I didn't quote that, so here he hints at genre being used to push some, well, genres to the margins and prioritize others. On the same page, Attebery brings up a point by Ursula K. Le Guin, who is a fantasy author, and we will hear a lot more from, but Le Guin says,
Le Guin points out that even though genre ought to be a neutral descriptive term, applying to the dominant mode of narrative realism as well as to such categories as science fiction or mystery, it is applied only to those genres whose primary readership is outside the power structure of the Academy.
What all of these points are alluding to is, in genre studies, referred to as
what genre you're putting this in, because genres in the the whole history of art, genres have been put in place to discriminate. Like high art was painting, sculpture, needlework, not high art. So it's so it's about access, and all women artists, female artists, historically have always had to defy genre in order to even have access to art forms. So I have no problem with people who are saying it's not really stand-up, and I'm like, it's not really the point.
According to Richard Coe, the tyranny of genre is normally taken to signify how generic structures constrain individual creativity. John H. Patton argues from a critic's point of view, saying genre criticism invites reductionism, rules, formalism, and causes, quote, critical determinism of the worst sort. But perhaps the worst part of genre is how it changes audience, reader, and publisher expectations. Hans Robert Joss says, quote, genre creates a horizon of expectation under which readers will interpret texts. Okay, so that makes sense. That was a bit much. Let's draw some examples about what that really means. Brandon Sanderson. You never fail to give me content to criticize. So, Brandon Sanderson, perhaps the most popular fantasy author of the late 2010s, has written these, quote, laws of magic. You may have heard of them. If not, here are summaries from the Sanderson site itself.
1. An author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. 2. Limitations are greater than powers. 3. Expand what you already have before you add something new.
I have a lot to say about the laws of magic, but firstly, can we appreciate the hubris required to write the laws of magic? Like, I'm not laying out laws of fantasy right now, as much as I want to. But okay. So we have these laws. First thing is to note is that in no way do these laws hold true for pretty much most pieces that we consider fantasy. The reader does not understand magic in Lord of the Rings or A Wizard of Earthsea, yet characters in both definitely use magic for solving conflict all the time to great effect. In fact, I think each of the laws are really absurd and entirely unuseful for helping authors write, readers read, and critics to analyze. But what the laws are really good at is establishing a horizon of expectation. By codifying magic systems, Sanderson has used his power as a popular author to establish what his audience considers good fantasy, or even as a framework for analysis in general. I've experienced this in my own life. I distinctly remember talking about Hunter x Hunter to a friend and them saying, quote, "It's like Harry Potter in anime. Very good, soft world building." Let me say it here. Soft world building or magic or whatever will never be a good measure of how good a text is. These distinctions are nearly meaningless and entirely irrelevant. But I digress. In fact, Sanderson explicitly tells us that he sees his laws as foundational to the genre. In the first paragraph introducing his laws, he says, quote, "Magic is a large part of what makes the fantasy genre distinctive." Is Sanderson wrong? Not necessarily, but there are a lot of books with magic and a lot of genres with magic that straddle the line, such as magical realism. So, who's to say, really? Nathan will have an essay up soon doing a much deeper dive on this topic, so you should go and check that out. But either way, the point is that Sanderson's laws are an excellent example of the sort of horizon of expectation that genre gives readership, and how that horizon of expectation can be damaging. Now, everything before about the horizon of expectation and the tyranny of genre was your biggest concern if you happen to be a straight white man. If you happen to be marginalized in any way, really, forget it. You have bigger things to worry about. Now this applies to genre as a whole, and to fantasy specifically. To be genred at all is to be marginalized, and genre texts often have liberatory powers, as Attebery notes in his landscape book, quote, "The Strategies of Fantasy."
In her acceptance speech for the 1989 Pilgrim Award, Ursula K. Le Guin explicitly makes the connection between the exclusion of women's texts and what she calls the genreification of non-realistic forms like fantasy. I first thought about this issue of genreification, she says, not as a woman writer, but as a writer of science fiction, fantasy, children's books, and young adult books. 4 fictional modes categorized by both publishers and academics as genres, and thereby, by the simple designation, excluded from serious criticism and consideration as literature. But later, having been myself so thoroughly genreified, I was quite ready to accept the feminist perception of the construction of literature as essentially political, an issue of power and control.
This is also, in essence, why this channel exists. This channel is dedicated to the serious criticism and consideration of the fantasy genre. Whether that genre exists or deserves to continue existing is up to debate, but that is the premise of why we made the channel. Now, we've talked about genre as a whole, but fantasy itself exists as a tool for marginalization. There's a lot to be said here, and the initial quote in this section is quite a good overview, but we'll return to this soon, right after we discuss a new form of defining genre. Speaking of which, identified a lot of problems with genre. Let's work on defining a model that's less susceptible to the tyranny of genre. So Carolyn Miller, the genre studies expert we talked about before, has come up with a concept called genre as social action. As far as I can tell, it has been very popular in genre studies since maybe the 80s, but I hadn't heard of it before doing research for this essay, and I'm expecting you haven't heard of it before either, so let's go over it. So what is genre as social action? Well, everyone talks about how difficult this article is to parse, the genre as social action one, but here's my best shot at explaining it. Many approaches to genre are fundamentally Aristotelian. They're fusing form and substance to classify texts. But genre as social action subverts this. From the article by Miller, quote,
"A rhetorically sound definition of genre must be centered not on the substance or the form of the discourse, but on the action it is used to accomplish."
And then later on in the same text,
Genre becomes a complex of formal and substantive features that create a particular effect in a given situation.
or if you would humor me with one more quote from Amy J. Devitt, genres don't just sit there, they do something. For example, an invoice is not defined by its form or even its content, but from the, quote, action it is used to accomplish, which is in potentially oversimplified terms, clear financial communication between a buyer and seller. Or, as another example, Devitt observed that tax accountants had to gauge their legal liability in letters, making their letters a distinctly different genre than, say, if you gave the same tax advice in a letter to your friend. Even if the substance and the form was the same, the genre was different. So, genre is not defined by form and substance, but rather, more importantly, what the piece tries to convey or advocate for. And from here, we can finally get to So, I just looked at my outline, and it seems that this section is as long as the last 3 sections combined. Well, okay, let's do this then. So with our new conception of genre, what is fantasy? Fantasy is defined by Brian Attebery as, quote, a set of texts derived primarily from the literary fairy tales and romance revivals of the 19th century. And he claims fantasy is judged by its, quote, effectiveness in conveying a sense of a radically altered or augmented world. Attebery, perhaps without knowing it or intending it, has given us both a form and a rhetorical combination, priming us for a definition under the context of genre as social action. Namely, that we have a rhetorical act to tie fantasy to, which is that fantasy as a genre can be defined to, quote, convey a sense of a radically altered or augmented world. If you wanted to change this definition to separate fantasy more firmly from science fiction or other genres, you could make a concession that the radically altered world needs to be along the lines of the literary fairy tales and romance revivals of the 19th century. But that defines fantasy as almost strictly a European tradition, which leads me to my first problem with this particular definition. While fantasy does convey a sense of a radically altered or augmented world, it is also consistently racist. I'm guessing most viewers of this video, or readers of the essay, are in fantasy circles of some form or another. And me calling a genre you associate yourself with racist might hurt, but when push comes to shove, there's really no way around it. Nathan will definitely make a video expanding on the race issue in fantasy at some point, so I will provide a TLDR here and point you towards the two excellent essays, Race, the Original Sin of Fantasy, of the Fantasy Genre, and 2, The Fantasy's Othering Fetish. The TLDR is races in fantasy have always stemmed from othering and racism. Even when unintended, this tradition is especially noticeable since Tolkien established a canon of races. Do the orcs, trolls, etc. look like people of color on accident? Or does fantasy just happen to have a tradition of associating evil with people of color? So, I would actually argue that in its current form, fantasy also pushes forward rhetorics of racism, almost as a rule. Though fantasy can also provide liberatory power to oppressed groups, as we kind of talked about before. There is another element here as well. I won't touch on it as much, but fantasy has a massive militarization fetish. A glorification and promotion of violence is visible in most of the fantasy tradition, enough to potentially label it as a genre defined by violence. This may also partly be why it is often relegated to be for children or teens or teen boys. As an aside, I don't really understand why we associate violence with youth. I mean, I understand that youth media has significantly more violence, but I feel like most violence is done by adults. This plays into the racism too, this militarization fetish. To make the killing of swaths of evil enemies okay, you need to otherize them, establish a coherent us versus them. The them in these cases are almost always the aforementioned orcs, trolls, etc., which happen to look like people of color. But here's a quote from Ursula K. Le Guin about The Wizard of Earthsea.
But there are no wars in Earthsea, no soldiers, no armies, no battles. None of the militarism that comes from the Arthurian sagas and other sources that by now, under the influence of fantasy war games, has become almost obligatory. A hero whose heroism consists of killing people is uninteresting to me, and I detest the hormonal war orgies of our visual media, the mechanical slaughter of endless battalions of black-clad, yellow-toothed, red-eyed demons.
Now, as you may have guessed, the same is true just as much, if not more, about fantasy, and gender/sexual discrimination. It is not hard to see this. I mean, hell, Ursula K. Le Guin wrote about her own book, It Was the Earthsea, quote,
Anyway, the stories weren't about the women. They were about men, what men did, and what was important to men. It's in the sense that a wizard was perfectly conventional. The hero does what a man is supposed to do. He uses his strength, wits, and courage to rise from humble beginnings to great fame and power in a world where women are secondary, a man's world.
Again, there's a lot to be said here, and there's a decent chunk of feminist fantasy, but it is often gatekept out of epic or high fantasy or any other subgenre you would like. Here, again, is a quote from Attebery.
When contemporary women writers incorporate traditional elements into fantasy fiction, as they frequently do as a way of reconstructing myths of the feminine divine and of female coming of age, they face a challenge male writers can avoid. That challenge is to find a way to make use of the authority conferred by the traditional storyteller's voice without accepting the accompanying cultural assumptions about hierarchies and gender roles. For the folk narrator's claim to attention and belief is that both stories and the manner of telling them are the entire community's inherited property, like a village well, and that listening to the traditional tales is a way of reaffirming one's membership in the community and its values. It isn't an option to accept the tale but reject the worldview it embodies, even if, as is often the case in European Marken, the dynamics of the story enforce the belief that female speech is dangerous and female agency impossible, that classes are permanently fixed, although lucky individuals may move among them, and that happy ending must involve heterosexual marriage and a reimposition of domestic order.
Again, this is a very brief overview. There might be more to come here, potentially its own video on our channel, but that's not currently planned. Either way, you get the gist. So, to bring it back around, the fantasy genre is defined by, quote, conveying a sense of a radically altered or augmented world. But the fantasy genre also has a habit of racism, sexism, and militarism that are deeply rooted in its rhetorical actions. But then, if you defy the racism, sexism, etc., you get relegated away from the genre. As we can see in examples of N.K. Jemisin not being considered real epic fantasy by only the most critical of readers on r/fantasy's readership. Devitt talks about this as well. Quote,
Genres matter not just as gatekeepers, but also as enforcers. Every genre carries with it sets of not just formal expectations, but also cultural ones, worldviews. Genres have developed out of the values, beliefs, and norms of those in power within the community, institution, and culture. They enforce, as Miller said, what ends we may have.
Attebery specifically points out Ursula K. Le Guin as an example of someone fighting the genre of fantasy. But let's say she's not doing great on Goodreads. The mainstream fantasy readership there isn't necessarily giving her amazing reviews or praise. So this still holds. So what do we do from here? Should we give up on fantasy? Well, not necessarily. I want to end on a high note here. We don't need to outright discard fantasy. The entire point of this video is to bring a serious critical examination to the genre as a whole, to move it forward. Amy J. Devitt, who we've quoted earlier, also describes how critical readers and writers, that's us, can interact with genre.
Genres work for social action when communicators actively choose and manipulate the genres they use rather than be used by them.
Here are the 4 ways to use genre, as Devitt lays out. 1. Genre mindfulness. Choose genres that reflect the desired worldview. 2. Genre resistance. Resist genres that have worldviews you disagree with. Genre revision. Revise genres to better perform desired actions. And genre creation. Creating new genres with desired worldviews. So what we need to do is, as fantasy readers and critics, and maybe authors, is either develop a new genre, leave this genre and boot it, or revise fantasy to become what we all hoped it was, and what we all hoped it could be when we started reading fantasy. Thank you very much for watching. This was But Especially Fantasy, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.